Hello and welcome back to the Scale Up Leader, the podcast where you learn how to scale your leadership. Today we've got Frank Mattis. He's the I've lost my page where I said there were I had written all this down. I just written it down and it's gone. Okay, today
Just hand it over to me.
Okay, hang on a minute. Today we've got Frank Mattis, author of Lean Scaleup and co-creator of the Lean Scaleup framework for corporate new business building and trusted advisor for big companies doing innovation and much more. And we're going to talk about corporate new business building. I'll bring Frank on screen here. There we are. Great to have you here today, Frank. How are you doing? Did I get the introduction okay?
Yeah, kind of. I recognize myself, Richard.
That's good. That's a good start. Is there anything you wish to add? Is there anything that I've missed? Is critical?
Good afternoon to the audience. I think we'll get touched upon this as we go along. That's perfectly fine.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me, Mr. OKR, Richard.
Yeah. It's great to have you here. No, we have some. We were talking a little earlier about the book, but it is actually, you mentioned OKRs there. We have some stuff in common. I work mostly with earlier stage scale-ups, or rather greenfield scale-ups, and you work with brownfield sort of corporate new venture building and so on. But I just wanted to ask you before we get into that, you have authored a book and you've created this this framework, the Lean Scaleup framework, and you're currently working on the second version of the book. Is that right? Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
The second version?
Yeah.
Okay. So the feedback, the first book is selling well, right? It makes an impact in companies, so nothing wrong with that. It's still kind of valid, but obviously in the 3 years that have passed since this book came out, I learned a lot, right? And made more distinctions and benefited hugely from working with great people from a great company. So the feedback that I got is, Frank, we would like to have the framework more operationalized. And I think the time has now come. Deliberately in the first book, I simply sketched it out, right? So to have some sort of USB, but now the time has come to make it much more operationalized. So that's the first upgrade to the next level. And the second one is, people have asked me, can we have some case studies? Can we see stories or read stories that show how companies applied that? And well, there are tons of bits and pieces, case study pieces dispersed. So this is how they do the pre-scaling validation. This is how they transition to scale. But moreover, there are half a dozen or so more lengthy case studies from industries as diverse as FMCG, as travel tech, as construction, etc., coming from a number of countries as well. So that, I guess, will help the practitioners to go beyond that 3% success rate that companies currently have in building new businesses.
Yeah, which is that different to? I mean, this is worth just digging into the difference between the brownfield corporate new venture building and the VC-backed sort of greenfield space. I mean, firstly, what's the difference, and secondly, is there a difference in success rates? And then we can talk about why that is.
So the greenfield startups, that means, Richard, if you and I get together and we have this great idea about a new pizza delivery service, right? And we find some VC money and off we go, right? This is the greenfield startup space, right? It's predominantly a financial play, right? So you and I obviously hope that we get rich as we deliver more and more pizzas on the world, right? And the thing is, I mean, if we stumble upon something that promises more value, it's not a hard thing to pivot unless obviously we convince our VCs. And you probably also know the story that, for instance, Twitter, now X, as they say, right, was in its early days a podcast directory service, right? And PayPal was originally a security app for the first kind of smartphones. So they say they pivoted along the way and obviously created much more value. And that's just fine in most of the cases for the founders as well as for the VCs. But if we look in the corporate venture building space, it is about creating new revenue streams, right, associated with the multiples to create additional shareholder value. Yes, but it's also part of the transformational journey. So the company wants to become a digital hub, the Siemens of this world, or let's take BP, one of my clients, saying we're in the oil and gas business now. In 10 years, we want to switch the whole tanker, pun intended, to become an energy company, right? And to do that, we have several routes that are possible. We can buy new companies, risky, expensive, right? We can acquire startups, right? The stats tell you 50% of the folks are gone after 2 years, or we can create and launch new businesses. So that means corporate startups are also there to pay into the transformational agenda. And hence pivoting from A to B is not so easy to be done. Coming back to the second part of your question, well, I mean, there are two parts of the journey, two big parts, let's call it like that. The one is getting the idea up to hitting the market. And then the second part of the journey is how big does it become after you hit the market with your first marketable product. And it turns out the success rates for greenfield startups and corporate startups in that first part of the journey are pretty much the same, right? So it's a 10, 15%. That's what 3, 4, 5 large consulting companies say. So the sad story in there is corporates are not able to use all the assets and capabilities they bring to the table that you and I, when we create our pizza delivery service, would only dream about, right? So that's the one part. But there's another interesting study that McKinsey did on the 10% that made it to market. And keep in mind, most of these corporate startups play out in B2B scenarios. So when we speak about the product, it is about quality, it is about delivering the specs, etc. It's about regulatory approval. It's about being able to deliver at scale, meaning the industrialization part, etc. So if we look at the second part and we look how successful corporates are in creating a sizable, profitable, sustainable business after they hit the market, McKinsey found that only 1 out of 5 hit a 50 million in annual revenues threshold. So if you multiply these figures, 10 to 15% times 19%, you end up with 3%. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of stats about greenfield startups once they hit the market, how big they become. But my gut feeling is if you look at the many startups that fold their tents after they hit the market, it's not much better.
Yeah. One of the things that, I mean, obviously, as someone from the startup world, looking at just corporate world, you sort of think that, especially once you've solved that product market fit problem, right? Which is, from a startup perspective, that's often considered to be the particularly hard part. But then as a startup, you're building from scratch, building from nothing. So everything is hard. And with the corporate, you're kind of like, okay, you've got product market fit. Surely this is just easy now. You just slot it into the machine that exists there, or you take advantage of all of these resources and this system that exists in this huge go-to-market, sales engine and all of that sort of stuff. Why is this hard?
Okay. Yeah. So first of all, let me iterate on that term that you use, product market fit. When I co-created Lean Scaleup with some 20 companies, London business schools, UC Berkeley, so some brilliant minds around the table, one of the things that we discussed is that, let's call it fixation on a single point in time called product market fit. We felt that companies are better advised if they see product market fit as a quality indicator. So you have good, you have excellent, you have lower product market fit. And obviously you have the experiments and the proof points to show that. But when you execute on your growth strategy, right, many companies leave the path then. They hectically get on in a frenzy to open up new markets. They leave a validated path. And then if you execute the bowling alley strategy, new customer segments, leveraging the customers that you have and or the technology you develop, you basically start at product market fit equals 0 again, right? So you basically have to go through the whole iteration loop. But coming back to the core of your question, well, the fundamental problem that corporates face, greenfield startups do not, but the fundamental problem that corporates face is that they have 2 value creation systems under one roof. And these 2 systems are mandatory to future-proof the company, and these systems are not compatible. So you have to find a way to make them work together. Let me dive deeper on that. The first value creation system is the day-to-day business, right? 99% of staff works in there, right? They sell stuff, they do the marketing campaigns, they recruit new people, they do the financial controlling, they do the procurement, yada, 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 the total stuff, right? And this system is designed to repeat a past successful business model, right? Depending on the industry, if you're a fast-moving consumer goods company, right, you learned how to make and market shampoo, right? And that's what you do in that system, right? But in order to repeat those past success stories, you have a stringent system built around that. This system is governed by processes, right, with rules in there, corporate rules, right?
Yep.
And it's a short-term focus. You look at quarterly results, annual goals that you need to achieve, and risk is a bad thing in that system, right? You try to eliminate risk as much as possible, right? So that you can have this process machine running at high speed. And on the other side, and by the way, I call this system the day-to-day business. This is the red shirt system. The red shirts work in there,
Okay.
right? Because this is the red oceans that they're battling in, right? For the same customers with comparable products and value propositions, maybe using even the same channels and the same suppliers, right? Highly, highly competitive. On the other hand, we have what I call the blue shirt system, the people looking for the blue oceans, right? New business models, new services that augment the existing products, etc. And the system is completely different. You're operating in a world full of unknowns. So the way to move ahead, and by the way, this has been proven scientifically in the 90s, the way to move ahead in such a system is build, test, measure, learn, and then you move on or go back to the drawing board, whatever the data tells you. And this is for the long haul, right? If we look at one of the world champions in corporate new business building, Amazon, right? It took them 11 years from the idea that upgrading their IT system could be paid by the customer, which was the germ cell of Amazon Web Services, until AWS became a profit engine, right? And they are now 80 billion business on the run rate. So how do you match these two systems, short-term versus long-term, process-driven, sticking to the rules versus exploring? And let's take just one concept out of experiments, right? I mean, the innovators, they live and breathe with experiments, right? But if you talk to the red shirts, right, they will say, hey, Frank, we're not running experiments, we're running processes. What are you talking about, right? So there's a big mismatch, and these two systems are incompatible. So what we learned some 5 years ago is you need to think about a system solution to a system problem. How can you connect these two engines? And it turned out that you need to play on 3 levels. The one is the methodology and the process. You need to think broader in the corporate context as compared to the greenfield startups, and you need to think longer in end-to-end journey. You need to factor in leadership because it's about balancing the now versus the new. And at the end of the day, since creating something, innovating is a people business, you also need to think about how the individuals from the red shirt system could work together productively with the individuals from the blue shirt system.
So you mentioned in this answer, you're talking about Amazon a bit. Now, I worked at Amazon for 2 years as well, and so we haven't sort of used that example. Yes. So I'd love to talk about this a little bit, because I think there's 2 topics that I think are really interesting here. One is for the audience in particular, and one is firstly, which is not Amazon related, but how do you define a corporate here? Because some of this stuff, like some of my customers, for example, I have one customer at the moment who has they've only been around for 3 years. They have about 50 people. They're turning over, tens of millions, or maybe less than that. I don't exactly know. They have one main product, and they're trying to build 2 or 3 extra products on the side of this. And their challenge is actually somewhat similar, although the culture is much more joined together and it's much more compatible. And oddly enough, in their particular situation, which is really common amongst a lot of my scale-up clients, they have not yet built this repeatable machine. They've got this machine that's kind of in the process of being built. And the
Yes.
challenge in some ways for them is to transition to building a repeatable machine and transition that culture of experimentation to a culture of execution. And that's actually one of the reasons I get involved with a lot of these organizations, but they want to keep their culture of innovation as well. So they're going from one side of this, we have this innovation culture, this experimentation culture. How do we execute? How do we think about that? And corporates are going from the other side. Is there a point at which suddenly you transition from being one to the other, or one type to the other type?
I think if you look at the relatively new companies, the Amazons, the Netflix, the Spotifys of this world, right, who managed to go to that transition, I see one common theme, which, to my understanding, applies both to the brownfield corporate startup world as well as to the greenfield VC-backed startup world. And it's if you're successful, that means if you're scaling hundreds of percent, right, per year. One startup that I worked with managed to grow 400x over 3 years, right? 10x, 10x, 4x, right? What you want to do is, first of all, execute at the product level, at the go-to-market level, but in a way that you do the scaling up, that you get more and more productive, and at the same time create the processes, the engines that enable you to grow that. And with such a huge growth rate, my thesis is it's not possible. It's simply not possible to have this in a top-down approach, right? So coming up with the quarterly goals that you set, I'm talking about stupid goals, right? Not the OKR stuff that you're doing, right? Or the annual themes and have people execute on that. It simply is too dynamic. In a corporate world, meaning the full red shirt system, where you have 3, 4, 5, 6% of annual growth, that might work, right? Only a few companies are able to deliver constantly that growth in here. But in such a high growth environment, it's not possible. So what is the sweet spot? And in my understanding is that you need to have teams that are empowered. Amazon speaks about one-way, two-door decisions, right? That are empowered to take one-way door decisions, meaning decisions that can be reversed if we find that they do not work. That have a high degree in autonomy on how they execute, but they are very well aligned with other teams and with what is going on with the whole company. So finding the sweet spot between autonomy and alignment, that's, I guess, is the magic of the success recipe.
Yeah, so I think because I was going to talk also about Amazon. My experience at Amazon, basically, Amazon has this execution engine which works really well, and there's also quite a lot of experimentation within certain boundaries there. So they're quite good at integrating innovation, incremental innovation, and even some semi-disruptive innovations. No one, Amazon Web Services or Amazon Retail is not going to disrupt themselves completely, but they will put bits and pieces around the place, and then they'll spin off things like Kindle or AWS when that was initiated, and then advertising, and then these massive businesses like that, and they'll try things like the Fire Phone and Prime Air and Prime drone delivery or whatever they're calling it. I don't know what they call that now, but they have all these different things that do spin off, and I think that what happens is they tend to have this layers of innovation. So you've got the corporate sort of like AWS or retail consumer, and within there's sort of pieces of innovation. But then if you want to do something that's a bit bigger, you then separate that out further, and the further away from the core, the further away the actual organization is. So you end up with AWS as a separate organization, and then I remember Prime drone delivery, which was quite disruptive to the core of Amazon Retail, even though it's an integrated service, it's quite disruptive. Was ended up being quite a separate organization. It was run by a separate SVP, and then they did things like even Rivian. They invested in Rivian. Don't know if that was successful, but that's external investment. But they have this spectrum of sort of like balancing things, and then they develop their execution from this experimentation to an execution thing. Like when they invented Prime, it was very much like, here's some experimentation, let's see if this works. And they rapidly got somewhere within 100 days, launched it, and then developed slowly into this execution system. But I guess a company like Amazon has that culture already, and that's sort of sorted out. A lot of more established companies haven't got that muscle, haven't got that piece of culture, that they can't integrate these things easily. Is that your experience? Is that what we're trying to solve here?
Yes, yes. My thesis is we need to look at first principles, as Elon Musk would say, right? So what is the whole approach that Amazon uses built upon, right? I mean, I guess you know them by heart, the 12, now 14 leadership principles. But the two of them stand out for me, and this is what Amazon does excellently, right? Number one is you have to start with the customer, right, and then work your way backwards. Jeff Bezos said it, Steve Jobs says it. This is the focal point, right? You don't do the happy engineering part and then try to find a clever way to market that brilliant stuff that you created. And the second is, when there's a decision to go for the bigger ones, right, the out of the box things, like when Amazon disrupted its book business with the Kindle, right, at least partially, or when they disrupted their CD retail business by launching Prime Video with own content, etc. They always make sure that they have teams that are autonomous. Here we are, right? But aligned, and aligned in the Amazon sense, as I understood that book working backwards, is you have a C-level sponsor, one who is measured by having this, creating that thing and make it big, right? If you look at the general company with the C-suite managers, they typically have their KPIs written deeply in red, right? You have the margins, etc. And by the way, you also oversee innovation, right? But coming back to my point, right? If we go back to first principles, like just like these two, you have to start with the customer, right? Find a burning hair problem, as I call it, right? A big problem that needs to be solved urgently. And your solution is so clever that he takes the hassle, switching from what he already has, the tons of workarounds, and even buying for getting your new solution. And you have that kind of C-level sponsorship, overseeing what's going on. And at the C-level, weaving into the many strands of activities that pay into the redshirt system, you already made two very important success steps.
So this is really relevant to that whole context of, or the concept of contextuality. I think is one of the topics that I found from the book. I found really an interesting concept, because it's something that in my corporate experiences, and I mean, I've been at Amazon and Google and Deutsche Bank, and I've been involved as a consultant with like Vodafone and IKEA and various others. I'll talk about IKEA in a minute if you want. But some of this stuff, I remember just thinking that context is like super important. And I guess that's what you're getting at here, is like, where is this landing? Because that is a extra, like when you're a greenfield startup, you don't have that. Your context is the market. That is the context. Your context is the investor. As a corporate new venture, new business, you've got this existing machine that generates profit that is really important to the investors and to the managers, and you have to fit with it and you have to influence it, and that's really important. But I'd love to hear, how do you think about this? Like, how do you express this to your challenge, and even what are the actual challenges that people, when you're trying to do something, how do you discover that this is the challenge, and what happens?
Yeah, thanks for providing me the stage, Richard. I mean, that's part of my mission, right? I mean, when that whole corporate venture building started, also on Silicon Valley, West Coast, Y Combinator, etc., that kind of thing, right? These guys were going for, say, the state of thinking at that time, which was the customer development piece by Steve Blank. Then one of his students, Eric Ries, said, this is how you build products. They called it the Lean Startup. And Steve Blank now adds the business model canvas from Alexander Osterwalder to that.
Yes.
But part of my mission, Richard, is to make companies aware that these Lean Startup centered approaches to building corporate ventures will not work, right? Even Steve Blank says, there was an interview, I think 2 or 3 years ago, that he did with BCG. The Lean Startup was never designed for the corporate context. If you apply the lean startup in the corporate context, you will only generate innovation theater, period, right? And that's part of my mission, to make companies aware that they need to think differently. Well, at the end of the day, you take the best what is in there, that kind of agile thing, and some terminology, product market fit, and traction, and that kind of stuff, right? But you need to think broader, and you need, meaning the corporate context, and you need to think longer, the end-to-end journey. And this was really a light bulb moment some 5 years ago, when the Lean Scaleup was co-created. One of the brilliant minds coming from an 80 billion German engineering company said, I find it strange, right? We look at desirability, are there customers who like it? And if you're unschooled in innovation interviews, you would like to take that sounds interesting or interesting idea as basis for your innovation. Wrong.
Yep.
It's a different story. We look at feasibility, which means two things, right? Number one is, can we solve the technical challenges in there? Can we 10x increase the resolution of the images, or whatever the USP will be? Plus, can we manufacture it at an industrial scale, right? And then after you went through these exercises, you ask yourself, well, can I make a profit out of that? So what should be the revenue model? What are the cost blocks, et cetera, et cetera? But this gentleman said, I don't find the corporate context in there. Well, you have that one slider where you see the process chart, the flow, and it says, here's so to say the concept, ideation, validation, scaling, etc. And you find a bullet point, and in that bullet point, you certainly find strategy fit.
Yeah.
But there's far too less, right? First of
It's
all,
kind of like an afterthought, like, does it fit with our strategy? And
yeah. First of all, I mean, strategy is such a hazy phenomenon, right? And obviously, you only need to look what's inside the strategy and find the right words, and then you can check off that mark, right?
Yeah.
So the corporate context is much more, right? So it stretches out over the whole end-to-end journey. Richard, it starts with what I call meaningful search fields, meaningful. So much that you can do, a small subset is relevant for your company. Then you find meaningful ideas, right? Then you validate in the corporate context. So for instance, you want to look at the functional strategies, right? If you got a head of procurement, right, who is measured by delivering the procurement processes, but also obviously taking procurement to the next level, you need to align with him. If what you're doing, working with a flexible network of manufacturing partners, is really what fits in here, right? And then you transition to scale. This is where the alignment at the upper management level between the red shirts and the blue shirts take place. And then in scaling up, obviously you want to benefit, you mentioned it already, from these corporate assets, the client access, the brand name, the tons of the experts, etc. You name it, even transactional data to feed AI models these days, etc. And you want to take these assets to de-risk and to accelerate the journey. So it's a huge, huge concept that the Lean Scaleup absorbed, taking in that corporate context.
Yeah, because it's such a different set of problems that we don't really think about it, and just having someone who's experienced in startup world doesn't help you. I'd love to just tell you about one of my experiences, and just to get your take on it, because I have a particular interpretation of this. This is a large furniture retailer, Swedish one, and they were doing e-commerce. They were launching e-commerce, and they've been doing e-commerce for quite some time, it's like 10 years. So this is like innovation on the core, but it's quite a significant change, not just because it's e-commerce and it's digital, but because of who they are and what they do and how they do it and what their strategy is. And this is something that I think is a really interesting problem, a really gnarly problem in some ways, because their whole strategy, if you look at their business and how it works, and everyone's familiar with them, and we've been to the big blue box, it's about the big blue box. And it's all about, how many people can I get into the door? How long can I keep them there for? How can I show them my entire range, which is structured in a really specific way? Like the design of the range is structured such that it's easy to present. Like they've got every single room, they have the stuff, and then they have the accessories, and then they have the little bits and pieces and so on. And then everything is designed like, here's the here's the modern design, here's the old design, here's the Swedish traditional design, and then here's the premium one, the medium one, the cheap one, and the super cheap one, right? And we see it all. And as you're walking around, if you're really careful in these shops, as you're walking around, you notice that every walkway stops after like 20 meters or so, but at the end of the walkway there's a display which has something particularly attractive on it. It's right there.
Yeah.
And it's as you're walking around, you turn left more often than right because people tend to look to the right more, right? All that sort of stuff designed so much to get you to buy things. And then you've been through the big furniture and you've seen all of the stuff, and you've seen tea lights everywhere and little light lamps and cushions, and then you go through the market hall and you pick up more lamps and cushions and all this sort of stuff. It's all designed to make it so that every single visit is a high basket size. Now, when they're doing e-commerce, they did e-commerce quite well. But there's one more thing, which is that the whole sort of like supply chain is designed to optimize that. So they supply things in boxes. It all comes into self-service. People put it together themselves, and then it's all designed for lifting a pallet into the showroom so that we can just pop the pallet there and people take it off there, and it's really easy. And then they're trying to do e-commerce, and now e-commerce, basically people go online and we don't have that walking through the store. They call it the long natural path, I think it is. They don't have this ability to walk through the store. You can't take people on that journey. You can't get people to put more things in their basket. So you can have this situation where your basket sizes are great. People are putting lots of things in there. Your conversion rate's great. But then even the logistics doesn't work, because picking and packing, like, if someone goes and picks and packs like the high margin items like the tea lights or the mugs, someone's got to physically go into a shop and pull them out of a big pallet and then repack them in order to send them. It's really expensive. And so this whole business was basically, I looked at this and I was like, hang on a minute, if you're successful in this, you'll fail because it doesn't fit your strategy. Like, it doesn't fit your entire, like, if you're successful at getting people onto e-commerce and having high revenue on e-commerce, it'll break. So how does this work? What's your advice for that sort of situation?
I'm not
I realize that's a really quite specific one.
But obviously I understand the point of the story. I see 2 points in that story. First of all, I mean, a lot of things that look good on paper, right? The e-commerce ambitions of that Swedish furniture company with 4 letters, they look good on paper. The strategy makes sense, etc. Let me throw in another example. MedTech company, one of the leading MedTech companies in the world. They said, well, up so far we sold X-ray scanners, MRT scanners to hospital. Now we have developed, that was some years ago, super clever artificial intelligence, and this software will look at the X-ray scan and will come up with the diagnostics and even recommend a therapy, right? And we will sell this as a subscription service, right? X dollars monthly plus Y dollars per X-ray scan. You know what the problem was? The problem was that the corporate accounting systems, the SAP system, and the corporate accounting policies were not able to process monthly subscriptions. They were designed to ship, sell, invoice boxes, right? But not monthly subscriptions, right? So, I mean, getting rid of that high touch, I would like to call it, when you're in that blue box, right, of that furniture retailer, has downsides, right? So it probably looks easier on paper than it is in reality. And the second story that I see in here is in the Lean Scaleup sense, has 12 modules, one of them being the one company mindset. Let me illustrate the point with a story. We all know the Kodak moment, right? What a few people know that was when Kodak started to go down, there was a competitor at the same size, global market share, right? Faced with the same challenge, digital photography, erasing silver-based photography. But this second company managed to grow by building new businesses. And as we speak right now, it's 20 times worth more than the remainders of Kodak, right? And this company is Fujifilm, right? And when Fujifilm did its analysis and said, okay, we need to take a hard look at our technical capabilities. We're not in the film business. We're in the surface chemistry business, which happened to be in our history starting with the silver-plated film, right? But now we're going into other directions. The CEO of Fujifilm said, well, it touches the soul of a company if you start to transform it by building new businesses that succeed, right?
Yeah.
And back then, Mr. Konomori said, that CEO, then CEO of Fujifilm, said, the problem is this is not a journey from A to B. The problem is that this is a journey from A to question mark. We don't know where we will be 10 years, 20 years down the road. So,
Yeah.
I mean, keeping that one company mindset alive and refrain from having the e-commerce guys versus the blue box guys is also an
Yeah.
important issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, IKEA had that problem of like it fundamentally is the same business, but they've got these different channels. But the channel is so disruptive to their business.
It's
Fujifilm,
it easily becomes us and them, right?
yeah,
We're
yeah.
the e-commerce and they are the
And
dinosaurs.
it was so interesting seeing the dynamic as an external. This a few years
Yeah,
back, but I mean, seeing the dynamic there because everyone had the best of intentions and so on,
yeah,
but
yeah,
the measurements would the things that they were optimizing for were fundamentally at odds, and it was just
yeah,
this is a real challenge because if you're successful, then we're less successful,
yeah.
and
And Richard, this is an
rationally wasn't.
important message that I have for the audience out there. The people working in the red shirt system, right? The 99% of staff, as I alluded earlier, these are not stupid people.
Yeah,
These are brilliant people. They understand the goals that they have to achieve, and they are excellently trained and have the mindset and the spirit and everything you need to achieve these goals. But they're working in a system that basically is designed for a narrow focus, for
yeah,
execution only, right? And this is
exactly.
what they do, right? So if you look at it from the helicopter perspective, right, you need to have this system plus the other system, the now system, the blue shirts, and find a way to integrate these.
So it ends up being with these brownfield sort of corporate new business building. We've got on the one side the advantage of all of these assets, this process, this ability, this go to market capability, the resources, the people, and all that sort of stuff, and technology and a brand and all that sort of stuff. On one side, you have that massive advantage. On the other side, you have the problem solving of how do I actually deal with the corporate part and how do I reintegrate and so on. And I think just talking about how to go about that would be really interesting. Like, what do you do? What are the main things that is there like 4 steps? Which
Well,
maybe that's
3 or 5 or whatever number of steps.
yeah.
No, it's not that easy. Let me zoom in on the first part as you introduced this question. You have those corporate assets and capabilities, right? The people, the brand name, the channel, getting heard by, if you're in a B2B scenario, getting meeting dates with those large potential clients, right? If you and I, with our pizza delivery service, we will not manage to get a meeting date with them. The problem is that these corporate assets and capabilities are right-sized to for the day-to-day business, right? And access to these corporate assets and capabilities is governed by a strict procedure, right? Because this is what the red shirt system does, right? To make it more to create a picture on that, right? You do not have in the typical legal department 10 legal people sitting around and waiting for jobs that might come on the desk, right? That's not how they operate, right? They are 2, 3, 5, and these are busy people, and they burn the midnight oil just to work through the demands of the day-to-day business.
And the chorus on both sides of the right. So they're looking at this and saying, well, you've got a problem. That's a massive problem. It's a $200 million problem. I better solve that. And so no matter how I look at the startup, it's smaller. Is that
Exactly.
sorry,
So
I didn't
yeah, as a startup, meaning an external startup that the company chooses to invest in and wants to make it big, or as a corporate startup, inevitably, as you say, you get in the long tail of activities, which means it takes 3 months, 6 months, or it will even never happen, right?
Yeah.
This is the sad truth in that system problem between the red shirt system and the blue shirt system. But coming back to the core of your question, how do you do reintegration? So first of all, I mean, you need to be really sure that reintegration is the best way to move ahead, right? So one of our clients, big company in construction materials, they build a platform for the whole industry, right? So bringing all the information together and saving everybody that participates huge amounts of money. Great idea, right? But if they would reintegrate it, right, they would lose neutrality. And they're fighting hard to say, well, it was initiated by that company, but see, we're a different legal entity, and this has been certified. And we also have a president that comes from a respected industry association. We fight hard to keep that neutrality, right? So, but let's assume that you found that it's best to reintegrate that business. What I learned, Richard, it's a process, right?
Yep.
It's not one defined point in time where you do the handover, right?
Yeah.
And what plays into that in coming from the lean scale-up theory is to say, well, once you did your validation in the corporate context, right? And once you transition to scale with the alignment between the red shirts and blue shirts, the first phase of scaling up has actually two missions. Mission number one is, that's the obvious, going from 3 to 30 customers, right? Or whatever the figures might be. But the second mission in that first stage of scaling up, 6-9 months, is create what I call business in a box that could be docked to the existing business. So at that point, you choose, for instance, to merge your customer relationship data to the CRM system that the red shirts are using. Why? Because then it becomes easier. You choose to look at the financials that you make in the language of the red shirt system so that they understand what's going on. And then at some point, you might even think about that the people originally from the blue side, now some blue reddish, right, on the process to become red, they share office space with the red shirts, right?
Yeah.
And initially there might be a sales team that comes from the original startup because they know the whole history, they know the arguments, etc., etc. But then they go hunting together, etc. So it's a defined process.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess in some ways, part of that is the slow transition from that entrepreneurial sort of slightly chaotic experimentation culture, risk tolerant or risk hungry culture, to like, how do we transition into the execution culture? And because the execution culture is so established, we need to transition into this execution culture, not just an execution culture.
Exactly.
And that's part of the challenge. I guess in some ways, this ends up being a significant overhead, but that's like, if one was a corporate entrepreneur, you might be looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, what an overhead. If only I was independent, we could do this much faster and easier. But then you miss out on all of the benefits as well. So it's like you've got that trade-off there. It's just part of the job, right?
See, one of the companies, that engineering company that I mentioned that co-created the Lean Scaleup, this gentleman said, you've got 3 years, right? After 3 years, the corporate controllers will come around the kernel and they will look at you with their red glasses on, right?
Yeah. Yep.
The red lenses, and judge on everything that you do, right? And if we look at the 400X corporate startup that I mentioned earlier, well, the corporate controllers came around the corner, and the corporate compliance officer and the corporate X officers and all the corporates, etc., and they decided to reintegrate. But guess what happened, right? Obviously, that's now a part of the business, doing well. That's not the point. But the people who drove that, they left.
Yep.
Because they don't want to get on the payroll of the mothership, right? They want to have the entrepreneurial freedom and that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think that's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. It's just a part of how this goes. And I think that, like, when I look at myself, I tried to be a corporate executive, a corporate manager in a large organizations, and I discovered that actually that's not what I like to do. I like to be in this role, which is coaching other people. And I think that the value of running a startup, I mean, even running a startup is not my thing. My thing is being a consultant and helping other people, because that's where I get energy from. That's who I am. And different people fit in different places. And so if you're the kind of corporate venture builder, there's some pluses and minuses there. If you're a independent entrepreneur, there's pluses and minuses there with a startup. If you're just a small business person, if you're a large or corporate manager, there's different kinds of environments that fit. And it's okay to sort of go, okay, well, I've taken it from this stage to that stage. And in fact, I've seen quite a lot of my clients go through, like, the founders and executives. They founded the company and they've grown to a certain stage, and then they said, you know what, this isn't for me anymore. I need to hand it over to someone else. And I think that's the same thing that happens in corporate land, but you have a queue of people, and you have to actually find the right people to hand it over to, who are embedded in the corporate world, but can understand the transition that needs to happen in that sort of like late stage transition. Is that right?
Yeah, and has the outstanding capabilities in liaising with the retrofit system, right?
Yeah.
Because we cannot expect, Richard, that just because there's a book out, right, the redshirt upper management ticks differently. No, they don't, right? So, but there's a lot of stuff going on. I'm currently working with a tier one in the automotive industry, and we're in the process of introducing the Lean Scaleup framework, etc. And we're doing some interviews, right? And one of the interviewees that I had this week said, well, Frank, if you try to make this mandatory, that process, please be aware that a lot of the decision making in our company is made in back rooms, right? When two C-suite members, right, they do their trading. I agree to this if you do this for me, right?
Mm-hmm. One thing I'd love to know from just in terms of how you're doing this, like when you say this large organization, in this case, an automotive, is adopting or planning to adopt Lean Scaleup, what does that involve? Like, how do you go about as an organization? How do you go about as a consultant? How do you go about helping them on that journey? Like, what do you actually do? And I guess this is a great transition to that we're coming to the end of it. But what do you actually do in your consulting work, your advisory work, and how do you help people? What does it look like?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I mean, what I quite often find is that these people responsible for corporate venture building don't have a clear view on where their big ambitions really stand. So they are teams working for 1-2 years, and they use the words that we exchanged earlier. They say, well, we're past problem solution fit, getting closer to product market fit. But if you talk to a Swiss women, they would say in private, what are these guys talking about? I don't understand, right? They should do some serious engineering work. That's what they're supposed to do. So there are two parts to the story. First of all, you need to install a very rigid progress monitoring. And the way that we co-created the Lean Scaleup, that's possible. You work with scorecards, and the scorecards have defined deliverables. And there's one team external, but company internal person who looks at what the teams did in their defined sprints, playbook, etc., and says, okay, I'm convinced, right? Green traffic light, or not fully convinced, yellow traffic light. So, and having these scorecards then gives you a good way to look at the health of your portfolio and establish portfolio management alongside that as well. The second piece of work is what I recognize is they don't understand where they stand. They using frameworks that were designed for a different purpose, right? Heavily into lean startup, but not in the corporate context and all that stuff that the Lean Scaleup shines in. And thirdly, they do not have clear what else they need beyond the process, the leadership aspects and the people and the culture collaboration aspects that make up a successful infrastructure beyond the lab, as I would say, to build new businesses. So what I typically start with, Richard, is assessing what is there, and coming up with some thoughts on where things need to go and the two next steps. So that's one part of my advisory. The second part would be some companies say, we would like to invest into consensus and motivation and determination at the C-suite level. To do that, we would like to speak with companies who are 1 or 2 steps ahead, right? Who already overcome many, many challenges that are in there. So what I do at this part of my business is to create custom-made peer groups and arrange meetings where they meet with their private advisory board, if you will. And then obviously there are a lot of bespoke projects like designing BP Launchpad some years ago.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Excellent. And who normally engages you? Like, who's the usual customer? Is it the CEO or the head of the innovation unit, or
typically C-1 or C-2, right?
Yeah.
The chief inno officer has a seat at the table of the C-suite, or he or she does not have, right? It depends on the company. And typically you find below him or her, you find people taking care for various streams like open innovation or technologies or something like that. But at this level or at the level below, there's one person who's charged with taking the systems forward, right? Do we have the best incubation, validation, acceleration approaches that are out there? And these are our clients.
Yeah, for sure. Excellent. Well, look, I mean, this has been a really interesting conversation. I feel like I've learned quite a bit. I mean, I read the book and I'm still learning lots of stuff from here, so it's really interesting. I think that that in terms of like how VC-backed startups can learn from this, to me, one of the things that I would take away from this is that just we look at in the VC-backed startup world, in the greenfield world, you look at the corporate world and you think, wow, you guys have got all this. Oh, if only we had those access to those customers, if only we had that go-to-market capability, if only we had those resources and that brand, right, and that established market, we'd just be able to kick ass and win, and it'll be so easy. And then on the other side, you look at the greenfield, the corporates look at the greenfields and say, if only we had that freedom, if only we didn't have the constraint, if only we knew. If the corporate would leave us alone, right, we could just succeed. But you have this interesting set of tension there, and I think that one of the things to look at if you're a greenfield startup is to look at, and you're worried about competition from corporates, is to look at the strategies of the corporates and say, well, okay, what is it that's going to be really difficult for them to integrate? Like, if I'm looking at just if I was in the furniture business, right, I could look at the biggest furniture, IKEA, look at the biggest furniture retailer and say, well, they're going to have a real trouble with particular kinds of e-commerce because their business just doesn't fit that really well. They'd have to do so much change. And it's like when you look at Ryanair entering the European aviation market, or Southwest if you're American, entering the aviation market, and you look at Delta or Lufthansa, you go, well, they can't really do this fast turnaround, low cost thing because they've got to deal with baggage transfers and huge networks and hub and spoke networks and so on.
Exactly.
So we'll be point to point because as a response to this, we can do something different. And interestingly, I think if you're in the corporate world, you kind of have to think about, well, what kind of thing would be the right disruption that does fit, that works, but that still has to fit with our organization. It still has to fit somehow, even if it's self-disruptive, right? Because you can still disrupt. I mean, there must be examples of companies that really have disrupted, like you look at Netflix, even Nokia was originally gumboots, right? And Nintendo was originally playing cards and so on. They've disrupted themselves and that does work, but there's a real interesting challenge of that transition moment and that reintegration moment. Excellent. Well, look, thanks very much, Frank. Really appreciate your time. If anyone wants to contact you, obviously they could get the book and read it. But it's called Lean Startup. I believe there's a second.
Watch out!
Lean Scaleup. Lean Scaleup. Sorry, I've been saying it correctly all the way along, and then right at the CTA moment, Lean Scaleup book. And if they wanted to speak to you, who do you want to hear from, and how should they speak to you?
I just communicated. There are tons of CTAs and booker calls, etc. on www.leanscaleup.com. So please visit that site, get more information, and book us a call there or send us an email.
Excellent. I'll drop that on the screen there at the moment. So Frank Matters, leanscaleup.com. So go there. You can connect to Frank. The book will be coming out approximately in
later fall.
2024, later 24.
No, this fall, this autumn.
This autumn. So that's soon. Okay, great. So you can sign up to buy the book or be ready to buy the book when it comes out. In the meantime,
if you just allow me one sentence, next edition is being co-created by more than 100 practitioners and half a dozen business schools. It's a fun process. So if you want to have the cutting edge and also mingle with your peers along the way, go to leanscaleup.com. You see also a link there on how to join the process.
How to join in, yeah. And I've actually joined in, and I'm having a read of the new version of the book as well, while I'm also reading the old version of the book, which is kind of challenging, but I'm still reading both of them. But that's great. So thanks very much, Frank. Everyone, that's everything for today. If you think you need help with corporate new business building, then obviously Frank's your man, and go and contact Frank and see if he can help you. If you're looking for help in the greenfields world, and you particularly want to look at how I'm on the other side. You have to point this. The other way. Yeah, I don't think Frank can see the screen. But yeah, if you're looking for help with that, with execution, like building that execution engine and becoming that execution engine, then that's what I do, and I help people with that. It's not just OKRs; it's the whole management system. But if you're interested in that, come to me. You can go to book.talktorichard.com and find an appointment with me. Otherwise, if you want to just get updates, subscribe to my LinkedIn. There's a newsletter. You can subscribe to that. Links are in the notes or in LinkedIn, wherever you're seeing them. In the meantime, connect with me, connect with Frank, and have a great day and scale well, whether you're in corporate or greenfields. Thanks very much.
Thank you. See you soon. Goodbye.
See you. Just stay on the line, Frank.